He never told me his name. I never asked. The bar had been the kind of place where anonymity was a courtesy, low light, no eye contact, everybody nursing something they didn't want to explain. I'd stopped in after a double shift, still smelling faintly of latex gloves and crime scene tape, and he'd been there at the far end of the counter like a shadow that had learned how to wear a suit. I felt him watching before I saw him. That slow, deliberate kind of attention that doesn't flinch when you catch it. We didn't talk much. That was the point. His penthouse sat above the city like it owned it, floor-to-ceiling glass. The skyline spread out below us like something spilled. He moved through the space quietly, unhurried, and I remember thinking that the stillness in him wasn't calm. It was control. The difference between a man at peace and a man who had simply decided, long ago, that nothing would move him unless he allowed it. I allowed myself one night. Just the one. I was already reaching for my jacket before the city had fully brightened. The wine glass slipped as I stood, his glass, not mine, and it shattered across the marble floor in the gray pre-dawn light. I didn't stop to clean it up. I didn't look back. I told myself that was the end of it. The elevator doors closed behind me, and I exhaled for the first time in hours. 53 floors. I watched the numbers drop on the small brass panel and tried to remember who I was. Isolde Nash. Forensic photographer, Unit 3, City Precinct. 29 years old. Owner of one underfed plant, one reliable camera bag, and exactly 0 attachments she hadn't chosen deliberately. I repeated it like a checklist. Like if I ran through the inventory fast enough, the last 8 hours would file themselves neatly into the category of things that hadn't happened. The lobby was marble and silence. A man in a gray uniform behind the front desk didn't look up. That suited me fine. I kept my head down, my jacket pulled close, and pushed through the glass doors into the city. It hit me the way it always did, not gradually, but all at once. The cold, and the noise, and the specific smell of a city that had been awake all night doing things it wouldn't admit to in the morning. A delivery truck groaned past. Someone was already arguing outside a convenience store half a block away. A pigeon picked at something on the curb with the exhausted authority of a creature that had long since stopped expecting better. I stood on the pavement and breathed it in. This was real. This was mine. The penthouse was neither. My phone had 17 missed calls by the time I got it out of my jacket pocket. 14 from the precinct dispatch line, 2 from my supervisor, and 1 from a number I didn't recognize that had left no message. I called dispatch back first. Nash. There you are. Sergeant Briggs sounded like a man who had been awake since yesterday and held it against everyone. Dockside Warehouse, Pier 11. Body found 40 minutes ago. Kwan's already there. I'm on my way. I didn't ask him to wait. I hailed a cab before the call had fully ended and gave the driver the address with the automatic fluency of someone who had been doing this long enough for crime scenes to feel like commuting. The cab smelled like pine air freshener and old coffee. I was grateful for both. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window and watched the city scroll past, the long gray avenues waking up, the shop shutters half raised, the early walkers with their hands in their pockets and their eyes on the pavement. Normal things. Ordinary things. The kind of things that existed in a world where you didn't spend the night in a stranger's penthouse and sneak out at dawn before he woke up. Before he woke up. I'd checked. I'd stood in the doorway of the bedroom for exactly 3 seconds, no longer, because 3 seconds was reconnaissance, and anything beyond that was something else entirely, and he'd been asleep, one arm resting on the empty space where I'd been. His face turned slightly away from the light. The tattoos had looked different in the quiet. Less like warnings, more like a map of somewhere I'd never be given directions to again. I'd picked up my camera bag and left. Pier 11 sat at the end of a strip of dockland that the city had been meaning to redevelop for 15 years and kept finding reasons not to. The warehouse was the kind of building that looked like it had given up on itself, corrugated walls gone orange with rust, a loading bay door hanging off one hinge, blue and white tape already strung between the bollards by the time my cab pulled up. 2 squad cars. An ambulance that had nothing left to do. Detective Kwan standing outside with a coffee cup and an expression I recognized, the one that meant it was bad. I got my kit from my bag without being asked. You look terrible, Kwan said. Good morning to you too. I ducked under the tape. I'm serious, Izzy. You sleep at all? I slept. Not a lie. Not exactly. What have we got? What we had was a man in his 50s, well-dressed in a way that didn't belong here, face down on a concrete floor with his right hand outstretched like he'd been reaching for something at the end. No wallet. No phone. No identification of any kind. The kind of scene that told its own story in the negative space, not what was there, but what had been carefully removed. I worked. That was the only word for it. I moved through the space the way I always did, letting the camera do the thinking, following the geometry of it. Wide shots first, then medium, then close. The hand. The floor. The heel of one expensive shoe, the sole barely worn. A small circular burn mark on the concrete 3 feet from the body that had no obvious explanation and would bother me for days. This was what I did. This was what I was good at. Not the other thing. Not last night. Not him. I'd been doing this job for 6 years and I'd learned, by necessity, that the only way to survive it was to stay behind the glass. The lens was a window, not a door. You looked through it. You document it. You did not step through it and make the scene yours, because if you did, you would take it home with you, and then you would never be alone again. Not really, because every room would have a body in it somewhere, just at the edge of your vision. The same principle had always applied to people. I kept the glass up. I kept it clean. I did not let anyone get close enough to fog it. So, what exactly had I been doing at 2 in the morning on the 53rd floor of a building I had no business being in, with a man I had no business wanting? Letting him look at me like I was something other than a woman who photographed the worst things that people did to each other for a living? I didn't have a good answer. I hadn't had one last night either, which was probably how I'd ended up there in the first place. Izzy. Kwan's voice came from somewhere behind me. You've got that one. I looked down at my camera. I'd taken the same shot 4 times without realizing it. The burn mark on the concrete. Same angle, same frame, same composition. I straightened up. I'm fine. He didn't push it. That was one of the things I'd always valued about Kwan. He knew exactly where the line was and stayed on his side of it. Most people didn't. Most people thought, "How are you?" was a question rather than a greeting, and that "fine" was an invitation to dig. I packed my kit. I signed the scene log. I walked back out through the warehouse into the morning light, which had gone from pale gray to a thin, watery yellow while I'd been inside. On the pavement outside the tape, I stopped and looked back at the building for a moment. Old habit. I always looked back once, at the end, not for any professional reason, but because it felt like a small, private acknowledgement. Someone had ended here. In a corrugated iron warehouse at the edge of a dockland the city had forgotten about, in the company of a burn mark and a missing identity, they had ended. I took one more frame. The building. The tape. The bollards and the gray water beyond. Then I turned around and walked back to the street, and I did not think about the penthouse, or the man in it, or the way he looked at me across a bar like he already knew how the story ended. I was very, very good at not thinking about things. I told myself it would hold. 3 months is long enough to convince yourself that something didn't matter. Long enough to stop reaching for your phone in the middle of the night, to stop catching yourself staring at the ceiling doing arithmetic on a man you never even named. Long enough to believe, with a reasonable degree of confidence, that you have successfully filed the whole thing under mistake, resolved, moving on. It is not, it turns out, long enough to outrun the consequences. The nausea hit me at 7:14 in the morning, in the stairwell of a condemned apartment building in the 9th Ward, 3 flights up and halfway through a scene I'd been called to at 6. I knew the exact time because I'd been watching the clock on my phone, running the same quiet calculation I'd been running for 11 days. How many hours since the last time? How long before it passed? whether this was finally the morning it wouldn't. It was not that morning. I made it to the window at the end of the landing. It was painted shut, but the cold coming through the gap in the frame was enough. I pressed my palm flat against the wall and breathed through my nose the way the app had taught me: 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out, and waited for the wave to crest and pull back. Below me, through the grimy glass, the street went about its morning. A woman walked a dog. A man in a hard hat consulted a clipboard. Entirely ordinary. Entirely indifferent to the fact that I was quietly falling apart on the 3rd floor. It passed. It always passed. That was the cruelest part of it, not that it was unbearable, but that it was perfectly, precisely bearable, just bearable enough that you kept going, kept showing up, kept standing in condemned stairwells with a camera bag on your shoulder and a secret you hadn't yet decided what to do with. I'd bought the test 11 days ago from a pharmacy 3 neighborhoods over. Paid cash. Put my sunglasses on, which was ridiculous given that it was raining, but the alternative was walking in as myself, and I wasn't ready to be myself yet. The result had taken 3 minutes to appear and approximately 3 seconds to rearrange the entire architecture of my life. Positive. I'd stood in the single-stall bathroom of a coffee shop I'd never been to before and stared at the 2 pink lines with the specific, hollow calm of a person whose brain has simply refused to process something and is waiting for a later date to reschedule the breakdown. Then I'd put the test in my jacket pocket, washed my hands, ordered a black coffee I didn't drink, and gone to work. That had been 11 days ago. I was still waiting for the later date. Nash. Rhea's voice drifted up from the floor below. She was the lead on this one, sharp, impatient, the kind of detective who took it personally when a crime scene didn't tell her what she wanted to hear. You done up there? 2 minutes. I pushed off the wall, steadied myself, and went back to work. The apartment was a secondary scene, not where it had happened, but where evidence of it had been left behind. Deliberate evidence. The kind of arrangement that takes time and intention, that tells you more about the person who made it than the victim it concerned. I moved through the rooms carefully, documenting everything: the placement, the angles, the particular grammar of it. Someone was making a statement. They wanted it read. I photographed it all and kept my face neutral and did not think about the fact that my body was, at this exact moment, doing something I had not authorized it to do. The precinct briefing room smelled like burnt filter coffee and dry erase marker, the way it always did at 9 in the morning when the night shift had just turned over and nobody had opened a window. I found a seat near the back, set my camera bag under the chair, and pulled out my laptop. Standard debrief. I'd been to hundreds of them. Sergeant Briggs ran through the active cases in the flat, exhausted monotone of a man reading from a list he'd already memorized. 2 open homicides. A series of arson incidents in the warehouse district. A missing persons case that had been quietly reclassified. I typed my scene notes and half listened and watched the wall. They'd repainted it sometime in the last month. The corkboard had moved 3 feet to the left, which had bothered me in the low-level, background way that small spatial changes always bothered me. Pinned to it now was the new task force material. Organized crime. A syndicate that had been operating in the city for the better part of a decade under a series of names and structures that kept dissolving and reappearing in different configurations, like something that had learned to survive by never holding the same shape twice. Briggs clicked to the next slide. Primary suspect. Soren Valerius, 34. Known within the syndicate as the Ghost King. I stopped typing. The photograph on the screen was surveillance quality, slightly grainy, taken at distance, the subject mid-stride on a street I didn't recognize. Dark suit. Head slightly turned, as though he'd sensed the camera. And even at that resolution, even with the distance and the angle and the deliberate avoidance of the lens, I knew the line of that jaw. I knew the way he held his shoulders. I knew, with a certainty that landed in my stomach like something dropped from a very great height, that I had seen this man sleep. The room kept going. Briggs kept talking. Someone 2 chairs over asked a question about the task force timeline and someone else answered it. I sat very still and looked at the photograph and understood, with a clarity that was almost funny in its neatness, that the universe had a very specific sense of humor. The man I'd spent 3 months not thinking about was on the city's most wanted board. The man I'd spent 3 months not thinking about was the primary suspect in a federal organized crime investigation. And I was, according to a pregnancy app that sent me cheerful notifications I had not turned off, because turning them off would mean making a decision 11 weeks and 4 days along. I closed my laptop. My hands were steady. I was good at steady. Nash. Reyes again, from across the room. You get anything usable from the Ninth Ward? Everything, I said. My voice came out even. Professional. Exactly the way I needed it to. I'll have the full set to you by noon. She nodded and looked away. Around me, the briefing dissolved into the usual post-meeting shuffle, chairs scraping, phones emerging, the low percussion of a building that had somewhere else to be. I didn't move. I looked at the photograph for exactly 3 more seconds. Same rule as always. 3 seconds is reconnaissance. Anything beyond that is something else. Then I picked up my bag, stood up, and walked out of the briefing room without looking back. Somewhere below the surface of the composure I'd spent 6 years constructing, something had just come loose. I could feel it, a small, structural shift, the way a building sounds different after a tremor, not broken yet, but no longer entirely sure of its own foundations. Soren Valerius. Now I had a name. He found me on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I'd spent the morning processing scene photographs from the Ninth Ward, and Tuesdays were the days I transferred files to the evidence server, which meant I'd been at my desk for 4 straight hours without leaving, which meant I was overdue for the walk I took every afternoon to the coffee cart on the corner of 5th, which is exactly what I was doing when I came out of the precinct's side door and found him leaning against the wall opposite as though he'd been there long enough to get comfortable. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't scanning the street. He was just watching the door, waiting with that same absolute stillness I remembered from the bar, the stillness of a man who had made the decision to be somewhere and was prepared to remain there indefinitely until the situation resolved itself in his favor. I stopped walking. My hand tightened on my camera bag strap. He looked exactly like the surveillance photograph and nothing like it at all. The photograph had flattened him, made him two-dimensional, a shape to be filed and classified and pinned to a briefing room corkboard. In person he occupied space differently, not loudly, not in the way that some men did, filling rooms with performance and noise. Quietly, like a shift in air pressure. Like the moment before weather. He pushed off the wall when he saw me. Unhurried. He crossed the street with his hands in his jacket pockets and stopped 6 feet away, and he looked at me the same way he had in the bar 3 months ago, that specific, leveled attention, the kind that doesn't ask permission. Isolde Nash. Not a question. He already knew. Of course he already knew. You have about 30 seconds, I said, before I walk back through that door and make a phone call you will not enjoy. You won't. Try me. He studied me for a moment. There was something in his expression that I couldn't immediately categorize, not the cold appraisal I'd half expected, not the careful blankness of a man managing a threat. Something more complicated than that. Something that moved across his face and was gone before I could read it properly. How far along, he said. The pavement seemed to shift slightly under my feet. I don't know what you. Izzy. My name in his mouth. The shortened version, the one I hadn't given him, the one he'd apparently found along with everything else. It landed somewhere I didn't have good defenses for. I said nothing, which was, I understood immediately, already an answer. He exhaled slowly through his nose. The expression crossed his face again, longer this time, legible this time. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't calculation. It was something rawer than either of those things and far more dangerous, because I knew how to deal with a man who wanted something from me, and I had no idea at all how to deal with a man who looked like the ground had just moved under his feet too. Who else knows? No one. The word came out before I'd decided to say it. Instinct or stupidity or both. And that's how it's going to stay. That's not possible anymore. His voice was even. Not cruel. Just certain, in the way that he seemed certain about everything. Not arrogance exactly, but the particular confidence of someone who has learned, through repeated experience, that the world generally arranges itself according to his assessment of it. There are people who watch me, Izzy. People who are very good at watching and very motivated to find anything they can use. If they don't know yet, they will. Then that's your problem. It's yours. He said it without heat, without emphasis, and that was somehow worse than if he'd raised his voice. It was the tone of a man stating a fact. The same tone, I thought, that he probably used to discuss things like territories and leverage and the kind of arithmetic that got people killed. I made myself hold his gaze. I've been photographing crime scenes for 6 years. I'm aware of how to manage a threat assessment. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Is that what I am? You're on my precinct's most wanted board. So yes, that's exactly what you are. He was quiet for a moment. Around us the street continued its ordinary business. A bus hissed past. Someone laughed on the far pavement. A courier locked his bike to a railing with practiced efficiency. The world had absolutely no interest in the fact that it was currently serving as the backdrop to the most catastrophic conversation of my life. I'm not going to hurt you, Soren said. I need you to understand that before anything else. The man pinned to our task force board isn't exactly building a case for his own harmlessness. The task force board shows you what people want to be true. It doesn't show you what is. He paused. You document scenes for a living. You know the difference. I hated that landed. I hated that he'd known it would. This conversation is over, I said. The conversation hasn't started yet. He reached into his jacket and held out a card, plain, matte black, a phone number printed in white. No name. Of course no name. When you're ready. And Izzy, he waited until I'd looked up. Be ready soon. The people I mentioned, they're not patient, and they're not careful, and they will not distinguish between you and whatever you're carrying. He held my gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked away down the street and did not look back, and I stood on the pavement with a matte black card in my hand and the distinct, nauseating understanding that my carefully constructed life had just developed a structural fault I was not going to be able to photograph my way out of. I looked down at the card. No name, just the number. Just like the first night, only what was necessary, nothing more. As though he'd always known exactly how much to give a person to make them come back. I put it in my pocket. I told myself it was evidence. I didn't throw it away. I gave it 4 days. 4 days of carrying the matte black card in my jacket pocket like a splinter I hadn't decided whether to remove. 4 days of walking past the briefing room corkboard without looking at his photograph, of sitting at my desk processing scene files with the specific, performative focus of someone who is absolutely not thinking about something. 4 days of checking my deadbolt twice before bed and telling myself it was habit. On the 5th day, someone put a bullet through my kitchen window. I was not in the kitchen at the time. I was in the hallway pulling on my jacket, which is the only reason this story continues. The sound was not what I expected, not the dramatic explosion of films, but something smaller and precise, a single sharp crack followed by the specific silence of a room that has just been altered. I stood in the hallway for 3 seconds, then moved low and fast to the front door, out into the stairwell, and down 4 flights without stopping. My phone was already in my hand. I didn't call the precinct. I called the number on the card. He answered on the 2nd ring. No greeting. Just, where are you? Stairwell. My building. Someone just. I know. Don't go back upstairs. Street exit, turn left, black car at the end of the block. Get in. You already have a car outside my building. I've had a car outside your building since Tuesday. I stood in the stairwell and breathed through my nose and thought very hard about what it meant that I was not more angry about that than I was. Izzy. His voice had not changed register at all, which was somehow more alarming than if it had. Left out of the exit. Now. I went left. The car was a black SUV with tinted windows and a driver who didn't introduce himself or look at me through the rearview mirror, which told me a great deal about the kind of household Soren Valerius ran. Soren was already inside. He was on the phone himself when I got in, speaking in a low, even tone in a language I didn't recognize, not angry, not raised, the voice of a man issuing instructions that will be followed without question, and he held up one finger without looking at me, which should have irritated me and instead struck me as almost reassuring, the gesture of someone managing a situation rather than panicking inside one. He ended the call. He looked at me properly for the first time. His eyes moved over me the way mine moved over a scene, quickly, systematically, cataloging damage. "You're not hurt." "I'm not hurt." I held his gaze. "You want to tell me who just shot through my window?" "The Draven family. They've been looking for a pressure point." He said it the way people said things that had been true for a long time and had simply been waiting for the right moment to become relevant. "They found one." I looked out the window. The city scrolled past, my city, my streets, the same avenues I'd driven down 1,000 times and felt, for the first time, like territory I no longer entirely understood. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now." He paused. "I'll get you a better one once we're there." Somewhere safe turned out to be a compound at the northern edge of the city where the skyline thinned and the buildings spaced out into something that almost resembled privacy. The gates were wrought iron, 10 feet tall, flanked by cameras that moved as the car approached. The drive beyond them curved through grounds that had clearly been designed to feel open while remaining entirely enclosed, mature trees, wide lawns, the careful architecture of controlled space. The house itself was the kind of building that didn't announce itself. No ostentation, no unnecessary scale. Just clean lines, dark stone, floor-to-ceiling glass that gave the interior access to every angle of the grounds. The home of a man who needed, at all times, to see what was coming. I stood in the entrance hall and looked at it and thought, he lives like a crime scene. Everything positioned deliberately. Everything serving a purpose. Nothing left where it doesn't belong. "Your room is upstairs." A woman appeared from a corridor to the left, 50s, precise, the demeanor of someone who had been organizing complicated situations for a very long time and found chaos mildly offensive. "Second door on the right. Your things will be brought from your apartment this evening." I didn't agree to stay, I said. Soren had his back to me, speaking quietly to a man near the far door. He turned at that. "Someone shot through your window this morning. Your apartment is a crime scene. You have nowhere else to be. I have a precinct. You can't tell about any of this without explaining how you came to be a target. Without explaining us." He held my gaze steadily. "Tell me I'm wrong." I wanted to. I turned the angles over Reyes-Briggs, the task force board with his photograph on it, and found nothing that didn't end badly. He wasn't wrong. I hated precisely how not wrong he was. The room upstairs was large and quietly considered, a bed with good linen, a desk by the window that looked out over the grounds, a reading chair positioned near the light. Not a guest room assembled in a hurry. A room that had been thought about, prepared. I set my camera bag on the desk, ran my hand along the windowsill. Old habit, I always read a room through its surfaces. Below, in the grounds, 2 men moved along the perimeter in a pattern that wasn't walking. Security. Close enough to respond, far enough to maintain the illusion of space. The gates were still closed. The cameras were still tracking. Beautiful, I thought. Controlled, considered, and absolutely inescapable. I pressed my palm briefly, instinctively, to the curve below my ribs. I had walked into a cage. The cage had good linen and wrought iron gates and a man downstairs who looked at me like I was the only variable in his world he hadn't yet learned to predict. I understood, standing at that window with the city just visible on the horizon beyond the trees, that the danger outside the gates was real. I'd heard the proof of that through a kitchen wall that morning. But the danger inside them was a different kind entirely. And I wasn't sure yet which one frightened me more. I found him at 2 in the morning in the library. I hadn't been able to sleep. That was nothing new. Sleep had been unreliable for weeks, the baby rearranging not just my body but my hours, pulling me awake at odd intervals as though already establishing who was in charge. I'd come downstairs for water and seen the light under the library door and stopped without entirely deciding to. He was sitting in the chair by the far window, jacket off, collar open, a glass of something amber on the table beside him that he didn't appear to be drinking. He had a book open in his lap, but he wasn't reading it either. He was looking out at the grounds in the way I'd come to recognize over 3 days in this house, that watchful, interior stillness, the look of a man whose mind never fully stood down. He heard me before I spoke. He always did. "Can't sleep," he said. Not a question. No. I pushed the door open and came in, because standing in doorways was starting to feel like a habit I needed to break. I sat on the other end of the sofa nearest the window, tucked my feet up, and looked at the grounds the way he was looking at them. Quiet. The security lights threw long shadows across the lawns. Nothing moved. We sat in silence for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable, which surprised me. I had expected the silences in this house to feel loaded, contested, two people on opposite sides of something enormous trying to share air. But this one was simply quiet. The library had that quality anyway, dark wood and ordered shelves and the specific hush of a room that had absorbed a great deal of thought over a long time. "Tell me about the tattoos," I said. I hadn't planned to say it. But I was a woman who read scenes for a living, and the ink on his throat and hands and the edges of his forearms had been a scene I hadn't been permitted to read, and at 2 in the morning in a quiet library it seemed like the most natural question in the world. He looked at me. Something shifted in his expression, not guardedness exactly, more like the pause before a door is opened that hasn't been opened in a long time. He set the book aside and turned slightly toward me, and held out his right hand, palm down, between us. The ink ran from his knuckles to his wrist, fine lines, geometric, interrupted by words in a script I didn't immediately recognize. "My mother's language," he said. "She was from the North Coast. Small place, the kind that doesn't appear on maps that other people use." His voice was the same even register it always was, but quieter, like a recording of itself at lower volume. "She died when I was 11. I had her words put here when I was 19 because I was starting to forget the sound of them, and I needed somewhere to keep them." I looked at the words on his wrist. I didn't ask what they meant. Some things don't need translation to be understood. "And the ones on your neck?" His hand moved, a reflex, almost quickly suppressed, toward his throat. "Those came later. Each one is a name. People you've lost? A beat. People I couldn't protect." The distinction landed quietly and sat there between us. I was a forensic photographer. I had stood in rooms where the distinction between lost and failed had made the difference between an accident and a crime. I understood the weight of that particular word choice with my whole body. "How many?" I asked. 7. He didn't hesitate. He'd counted them so many times the number lived at the front of his mouth. "The first was my brother. He was 14. I was 16 and I thought I knew how to keep us both safe, and I was wrong." I said nothing. In my experience, silence was almost always the right response to that kind of grief, not the silence of discomfort, but the silence of someone making room. Soren looked back at the window. The syndicate wasn't something I chose in the way people choose things. It was what was already there when I needed something to stand between me and the people who'd taken Marcus. I built it into what it is because the alternative was to remain something that could be picked off. Powerless. He paused. "I'm aware that's not a justification." I didn't ask for a justification. He turned to look at me then, and there was something in it that I hadn't seen on his face before, not in the bar, not in the street outside the precinct, not in the car. Something unguarded. Raw at the edges, the way old things are when they're finally brought into light. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone easier to keep at a distance." I looked at him for a moment. The low light of the library caught the line of his jaw, the ink at his throat, the careful set of his shoulders that was beginning, over 3 days in close quarters, to read less like control and more like the habit of a man who had never been permitted to put it down. "I photograph crime scenes," I said. "I am professionally trained to see through the surface of things to what's underneath. Keeping me at a distance was never going to work." Something moved across his face. Not the near smile from outside the precinct. Something quieter than that, and more serious, and significantly more dangerous to the architecture of the walls I'd spent the last 3 months reinforcing. He reached across the space between us slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who understood exactly what he was doing, and turned my hand over on the cushion. He didn't hold it. He just rested his fingers against my palm and looked at me with the directness he brought to everything, unblinking, unhurried. "I'm going to keep you safe," he said. "Both of you. Whatever it costs." I should have said something measured. Something that maintained the appropriate distance between a woman with a camera and a man with 7 names on his throat. I had a list of those measured things. I'd been composing it for days. Instead, I turned my hand over and let my fingers close around his, and said nothing at all. Outside, the security lights held steady. The grounds were still. The gates were closed. For the first time in as long as I could remember, the stillness felt less like a cage and more like shelter. Reyes found me on a Thursday. Not at the compound. She didn't know about the compound, and I intended to keep it that way, but at the coffee cart on 5th, which I'd been returning to twice a week, because I needed the city, needed the ordinary percussion of it, needed to stand on a pavement with strangers and remember that a world existed beyond wrought iron gates, and a library where a man had once turned my hand over and rearranged something fundamental inside me. She was already there when I arrived, leaning against the wall with 2 cups, which told me this was not a coincidence. "You're hard to find lately," she said, handing me one. "I've been on extended leave. Medical." That much was officially true. Briggs had signed the paperwork without asking too many questions, which was one of the few things I was grateful for. "Right." She looked at me over the rim of her cup. Reyes had the eyes of someone who had spent 15 years interviewing people who were lying to her, and she'd gotten very good at it. "How are you feeling?" "Better." Also true, technically. The nausea had largely resolved. The rest of it, the compound, the gates, the man with 7 names on his throat sleeping 2 doors down from me, was not something that could be summarized as feeling better or worse. It was simply a new set of coordinates. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then, "We know you're in contact with him, Izzy." The coffee in my hand was very hot. I focused on that, the heat through the paper cup, the specific weight of it, and kept my face exactly where I needed it. "I don't know what you're referring to." "Soren Valerius." She said it quietly, without theater. "We had eyes on your building the night of the shooting. We saw the car. We ran the plates." She paused. "We've been building this case for 2 years, Nash. Federal involvement, 3 jurisdictions. And we need something from inside that we don't have yet." I looked at a point past her shoulder. A bus was pulling up at the stop across the street, its doors folding open, people filing out into the morning with their shoulders hunched against the cold. Ordinary. Unthreatened. "You want me to gather evidence," I said. "You're already inside, Izzy. You have a camera. You have access we don't. You notice things, it's what you do. We're not asking you to do anything you don't already know how to do." She let that sit. "We'd provide full protection. Witness immunity. Everything made clean on your end. All of it. All of it." I turned the phrase over. There was a version of this conversation in which it was simple, in which I was a law enforcement professional who had, through a series of events she had not planned, obtained proximity to a federal suspect. And the correct thing to do was exactly what Reyes was describing. I had taken an oath. I believed in the work. I had stood in enough rooms where the law was the only thing that stood between the living and the worst things people did to each other. I knew all of that. I had built my life on all of that. I also knew what 7 names on a man's throat felt like under my fingers in the dark. "I need time," I said. "We don't have a lot of it." The Draven situation is accelerating. If Valerius moves before we do, we lose him again, and this time people will die that don't have to. She held my gaze. You know I wouldn't ask this if there were another way. I did know that. Reyes was not a person who moved people around like pieces if she had an alternative. That was precisely what made this harder. I walked back to the car Soren had sent for me and sat in the back seat and watched the city for the entire 40-minute drive without seeing any of it. He was in the main room when I got in, standing at the long table with two of his people, a map spread open between them. He looked up when I entered, and whatever was on my face made him say something quiet to the others and wait until they'd left before he spoke. What happened? Nothing. Difficult morning. I set my bag down and moved to the window and stood with my back to him because I needed 30 seconds in which he couldn't read my face. Is the situation with the Dravens getting worse? A beat. Yes. How bad? Bad enough that I need to move on it before the end of the week. He came to stand beside me. Not close enough to crowd, not far enough to be distant, that precise, considered proximity that I had catalogued 100 times in the last 10 days and still couldn't fully account for. I'm handling it. I know you are. I turned to look at him. His face and profile was composed, directed outward toward whatever the grounds represented, threat, perimeter, the edge of the controlled world. Soren, if there were evidence against you, fabricated, manipulated, whatever, would you tell me? He turned then. The look he gave me was long and searching and entirely still. Yes, he said. There is. The task force has a witness whose testimony was bought by the Dravens 18 months ago. It's the spine of their case. I've been trying to surface it for 6 months. I held his gaze. Can you prove it? Not yet. I nodded slowly and looked back at the window. The grounds lay undisturbed. The trees held their positions. Everything exactly where it was supposed to be. What Reyes wanted was evidence of Soren's guilt. What I was now carrying, quietly, in the private architecture of everything I'd observed in this house, was something that looked increasingly like evidence of his innocence. Those were not the same assignment. They had never been the same assignment, and I was only just now fully understanding why. I had 2 loyalties, and they were pulling in directions that did not reconcile. I was the lens. I was supposed to stay behind it. I was supposed to document and withdraw and let other people make the judgments. Somewhere in the last 10 days, without permission, without announcement, I had stepped through the glass. Difficult morning, Soren said quietly beside me. Yes, I said. I told you. He didn't push further. He stood beside me and watched the grounds, and I stood beside him and turned the most important decision of my life over in my hands like a piece of evidence I hadn't yet found the category for. I hadn't wanted to go. Soren had explained it the way he explained everything, with the economy of a man who doesn't waste words because he's never had to convince anyone of anything twice. The Aldrin Foundation Gala was neutral ground, 40 years of tradition, attended by every significant family in the city whether their money was clean or not. Appearing together was a statement. Staying away was a different kind of statement, and in the current climate, the wrong one. You want to use me as a shield, I said. I want to put you somewhere with 400 witnesses and 20 of my own people. He held my gaze. The compound is defendable. A public venue is harder to touch. Sometimes visibility is the safest position. He was right. I was developing a profoundly irritating habit of recognizing when he was right. The dress he'd had sent to my room was midnight blue, long, carefully chosen to accommodate a silhouette that was now unmistakably, irrevocably changed. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself for a long time. For months. The curve was no longer something I could architectural around with layered clothing. It simply was present and undeniable and, in the low light of the dressing room, quietly astonishing. I pressed my palm to it, the way I always did now. Then I picked up my mask, white, minimal, the kind that covered the eyes and suggested anonymity without committing to it, and went downstairs. Soren was waiting in the entrance hall. Dark suit, black mask held at his side, and the particular quality of stillness he carried into rooms that made other people reflexively aware of where he was. He looked at me when I came down the stairs, that full, leveled attention, and said nothing for a moment. "You look." "Don't," I said. "Let's just go." The corner of his mouth moved. He offered his arm, and I took it, because some performances require commitment. The gala occupied the top 3 floors of the Aldrin Building, chandeliers, string quartet, the particular species of wealth that doesn't announce itself because it's never needed to. Masked figures moved through candlelit rooms in the slow choreography of people who were simultaneously being social and conducting business. I had photographed scenes with less deliberate staging. For the first hour, it was almost manageable. Soren moved through the room the way he moved through every room, unhurried, precise, exchanging words with certain people and not others, his hand at the small of my back, a pressure I was doing my best not to read too much into. I kept my shoulders level and my expression neutral and watched the room the way I always watched rooms. I noticed the man near the east corridor at 11:43. He was positioned wrong. That was all at first, just a wrongness of position, the slight misalignment of a person who is in a place for a reason other than the stated one. His mask was full face, which was unusual for the event. His drink had not been touched in 20 minutes. He was watching the room with the patience of someone who was waiting for a specific moment rather than enjoying a general occasion. I had spent 6 years learning to read that kind of patience. I turned toward Soren. East corridor. Full mask. He's been static for 20 minutes. Soren didn't look. That was the first thing that told me he was very good at what he did. He didn't move his eyes at all, just processed, recalibrated, his hand at my back shifting slightly. I see him. There's a second one. Left of the staircase. I found the second without turning my head. He was right. Dravens? I said quietly. Almost certainly. His voice was entirely level. Around us the string quartet continued. A woman in red laughed at something near the window. "I need you to walk with me to the south terrace. Slowly. Don't look back. Your people. Already moving." His hand applied the gentlest pressure. "Trust me." 2 words. The simplest instruction he had ever given me. I thought of Reyes and the matte black card and the 7 names and the library at 2 in the morning and the decision I still hadn't formally made but had, in every way that mattered, already made. I walked with him toward the south terrace. We didn't make it. The first shot came from above, a balcony. I registered distantly, bad angle, fired in panic or poor light, and it hit the pillar 2 feet to my left with a crack that sent the room into immediate chaos. Masks screaming, the string quartet dissolving mid-phrase. Soren had me by the arm before the echo finished, pulling me low and fast toward the nearest wall, and his body was between me and the balcony before I'd fully processed that we were being shot at. Down. He put me behind a marble column and stayed in front. From somewhere across the room came the flat sound of his own people responding, not panicked, coordinated, the sound of a plan executing. He had anticipated this. He had walked in here already knowing it was possible and had mapped the room accordingly. He had put me nearest the exit. I understood that now. "Soren," my voice was steady, which surprised me. "I have you." He didn't look away from the room. "Don't move." It lasted 4 minutes. I know because I counted the same way I counted everything, the way I had always counted, 4 counts in and 4 counts out, keeping the breath moving because if the breath moves the mind stays clear. For minutes of controlled chaos of his people and the Draven's people conducting something that was not quite a gunfight and not quite not one. And then it was over, the sounds settling, the shouting resolving, the particular silence that falls after violence has passed through a space like weather. Soren turned to me. His mask was gone. There was a cut at his jaw, shallow, already clotting, a fragment or a graze, something that had come close enough to mark him. He looked at me with an expression I had no professional category for because it wasn't anything I'd ever photographed. It was too unguarded for that. Too immediate. His eyes dropped to my abdomen. 1 second, no more. Then back to my face. Are you hurt? No. I reached up, without planning to, and pressed my fingers to the cut at his jaw. He went very still. You're bleeding. It's nothing. I know what nothing looks like. My voice was steady still, but something underneath it was not. This isn't it. He covered my hand with his. The room around us was beginning to resolve into the aftermath: voices, movement, the distant sound of sirens approaching from the street. In approximately 6 minutes, this space would become a crime scene, and I would be a forensic photographer standing inside it, and the entire careful architecture of the last 2 weeks would become impossible to contain. I knew all of that. I kept my hand where it was. He was gone when I woke up. Not in the way of the penthouse, not a vanishing, not an absence that left a shattered wine glass and a silence I'd spent 3 months trying to categorize. This was different. His side of the bed was still warm. His jacket was still on the chair. On the nightstand, he'd left a single sheet of paper, folded once, with my name written on the outside in a hand that was precise and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who did everything with the same quality of attention. I opened it. 3 lines. Stay inside. Trust Marin. I'll be back before dark. I read it twice. Then I folded it along its original crease and held it and looked at the ceiling and understood, with the specific clarity that came to me sometimes in the early morning when the house was quiet and my mind hadn't yet assembled its defenses, that I was frightened. Not of what he would find. Of what it would cost him to go looking. Marin, the precise, unflappable woman who ran the compound with the quiet authority of someone who had seen everything at least twice. Brought tea to the library at 7 and answered exactly none of my questions with a serenity that suggested she had been specifically briefed to do so. She told me Soren had left at 4. She told me his people were with him. She told me the gates were secured and the perimeter was covered and that I should eat something, which I did, because the baby had opinions about that regardless of the circumstances. I spent the morning doing the only thing I knew how to do when I had no control over a situation. I worked. I processed the gala photographs from my phone. I'd taken 3 shots on instinct in the chaos, the reflex of 6 years, and 2 of them were usable, and I sat with what I had and thought about Reyes and what she'd asked and what I was now, finally, prepared to do about it. Because there was evidence. Not of what the task force thought. Of what was actually true. I had been inside this house for 2 weeks. I had Izzy Nash's eyes and Izzy Nash's instincts, and I had looked at every room I was permitted to enter the way I looked at every room, reading the surfaces, reading the arrangement, reading what was present and what was conspicuously absent. What I had found was not the infrastructure of a man running an active criminal enterprise. What I had found was the infrastructure of a man managing a defensive war he hadn't started, against a family that had corrupted the only evidence that could have ended it cleanly. I called Reyes at 9. I have something for you, I said. But it's not what you asked for. It's better. She was quiet for a moment. I'm listening. The Aldrin Gala last night. The Dravens sent 2 people. I can place them, I have the photographs, and I have the positions. That's conspiracy to commit in a venue with 400 witnesses, and it puts the Dravens in the room, which opens the question of why they needed Valerius removed badly enough to go public. I paused. And then there's the witness. The one whose testimony was purchased 18 months ago. I have a name. I have a timeline. I have enough to pull the thread. Another silence. Longer this time. Izzy, how do you have a name? Because I've been doing what you trained me to do, I said. Reading what's actually in the room instead of what someone told me to expect. She didn't push further. Reyes was, at her core, a detective, and a detective who has just been handed a better case doesn't argue about the methodology. We agreed on a meeting point. I hung up and sat with my hands in my lap and breathed through the 4 count and felt, for the first time in 2 weeks, like something was resolving rather than accumulating. Soren came back at 5:30. I heard the gates before I heard the car, then the car on the drive, then the front door. I stayed in the library. I heard him speak to Marin in the hallway, brief, low, and then his footsteps on the stairs, and then the library door. He looked the same. That was the first thing. No visible damage beyond the dressed graze at his jaw from the night before. No evidence on the surface of whatever the day had required of him. He had that quality, the ability to re-enter a room having done irrevocable things and carry none of the residue where anyone could see it. Except that I was very good at reading rooms, and I could see it. It was in the set of his shoulders, slightly lower than usual. In the way he stood inside the door for a moment before moving, not hesitating exactly, but a man returning to something he wasn't entirely certain he still deserved. "Is it done?" I asked. "Yes." I nodded. I didn't ask for the details. I had made my peace with that somewhere in the long hours of the morning. There were rooms I would not photograph, things I would document with my understanding rather than my lens, and this was one of them. The Dravens had put a bullet through my kitchen window. They had sent men to a gala to finish what that bullet started. They had made themselves a threat to a child who had not yet been born and had no stake in any of it. I was a woman who believed in the law. I was also a woman who had stood in enough rooms to know that the law, on its own, was sometimes simply too slow. Soren crossed the room and stopped in front of me. He looked at me with that expression he'd had in the aftermath of the gala, unguarded, immediate, the face beneath the face. "I told you I would keep you safe," he said. "Both of you." "I know." I reached up and touched the dressed graze at his jaw, the same gesture as last night, deliberate this time, not reflex. "I called Reyes this morning. I gave her the gala photographs and the witness name. She has enough to dismantle the Dravens through the courts and enough to pull the fabricated testimony. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen." He was very still. "You went to the task force." "I went to a detective I trust with evidence that is accurate." "There's a difference." I held his gaze. "You told me the task force board shows what people want to be true, not what is." I gave them what is. "What's actually in the room?" Something shifted in his face. That slow, serious thing that wasn't quite a smile and was more valuable for not being one. "You're going to be very difficult to be in a relationship with," he said quietly. "You already knew that." "Yes," he said. I did. Outside, the evening was settling over the grounds, the security lights beginning their long work, the gates holding their position, the trees absolutely still. The city was out there somewhere beyond them, doing what cities did, generating its evidence, waiting for someone to come and read it. For the first time since the penthouse, since the bar, since a night that had set every subsequent thing in motion, I was not trying to leave. The house had no gates. That was the first thing I noticed when Soren drove me there on a Saturday morning in early spring, 3 weeks after the gala. 2 weeks after Reyes had called to tell me that the Draven family's principal lieutenants were in federal custody and the fabricated witness had been formally recanted. The house sat at the end of a road lined with trees that were just beginning to consider the idea of leaves, a stone building, 2 stories, with a garden at the back that someone had once cared about and that had been waiting patiently ever since for someone to care about it again. No cameras on the perimeter. No men walking the tree line. No wrought iron and no intercom and no architecture of vigilance built into every sightline. Just a house. On a road. With a garden that needed work. "This is not what I expected," I said. Soren stood beside me on the front path with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the building with the expression I'd come to recognize as his version of feeling something he hadn't fully processed yet, a slight compression around the eyes. A stillness that was different from his operational stillness, softer at the edges. "What did you expect?" "Something with a panic room. Possibly a moat." That moved the corner of his mouth. "There's a very good lock on the back door." Reassuring. He turned to look at me. "The compound is being transferred. The syndicate's remaining operations have been handed to a legal trust. I've spent 6 weeks structuring it with 2 lawyers and an accountant who I'm fairly certain suspects everything but is too well paid to ask. The name is retired." He said it evenly, the same register he used for everything, but I had been reading this particular room long enough to hear what it cost him. The Ghost King doesn't live here. Whoever lives here is someone I'm still working out. I looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was thin and clear, the kind that doesn't flatter anything but makes everything honest, and in it he looked like what he was. A man in his mid-30s who had been operating at full tension for so long that the releasing of it was its own kind of exhaustion. Tired in the deep way. The way that sleep doesn't entirely fix. I can work with that, I said. We went inside. The rooms were empty, which I'd expected, and larger than the exterior suggested, which I hadn't. My footsteps echoed. I moved through the spaces the way I moved through every new space, reading the light, reading the angles, understanding what the rooms wanted to be used for. A good kitchen, south-facing, which mattered more to me now than it ever had before. A room at the back that overlooked the garden, quiet, with a particular quality of stillness that came from being the room furthest from the street. I stood in the doorway of that room for a long time. Soren appeared behind me. He looked over my shoulder at the empty space, the bare walls, the window onto the overgrown garden, the light moving across the floor in the slow way that light moves in rooms that have been waiting. Good room, he said. Yes, I said. It is. Neither of us said what the room was for. We didn't need to. My hand had already moved, the way it always did now, not the anxious reflex of early weeks, not the secret gesture of a woman managing a thing she hadn't decided how to hold, but something settled. Something that had come to feel like its own kind of certainty, in a life that had not previously had a great deal of that. 5 months. The pregnancy app had stopped sending me cheerful notifications because I'd finally, 2 weeks ago, turned off the ones I didn't want and kept the ones I did. A small act of administration that had felt, at the time, disproportionately significant. Soren's hand came to rest over mine. He did it without looking at me, without announcement, the way he did most things, not performing the gesture, simply making it. We stood in the doorway of the empty room and looked at the garden, and the light continued its slow work across the floor, and outside the trees along the road held their new leaves up to the morning as though offering them for inspection. I need to tell you something, he said. Then tell me. He was quiet for a moment. In the months I had known him properly, known the man who existed beneath the name and the reputation and the 7 names inked on his skin, I had learned that his silences were not evasions. They were the shape of a man thinking carefully before he spoke, because he had learned, the hard way, that words said carelessly were very difficult to take back. I don't know how to do this, he said. The version of this where there are no gates. Where I'm not accounting for every variable. A pause. I've been managing threat assessments since I was 16 years old. I don't have a reference for what comes after that. I turned to face him. He let me look. That was the thing about Soren, the thing I had not expected and had not been able to maintain my distance from. He let me look at him. Fully. Without flinching from it or managing it or holding anything back. Neither do I said. I've been keeping glass between myself and everything for 6 years. I don't have a reference for not doing that either. So we're both working without a map. We're both working without a map, I agreed. Something in his face eased. Not all the way, it would be a long time before all the way, for either of us, and I understood that and had stopped expecting otherwise. But enough. The compression around his eyes softened. His shoulders dropped a fraction, not the defeated drop of Chapter 8's doorway, but something voluntary. Chosen. He leaned down and pressed his lips to my temple, and stayed there for a moment, and said nothing further, which was exactly right. We stood in the doorway of the empty room in a house with no gates, on a road where the trees were making their slow spring argument for beginning again, and I did something I was not professionally trained to do and had spent a long time avoiding. I put the camera down. Not literally. My camera bag was in the car, as it always was, because some habits are structural and some are simply true. But the other one. The internal one. The lens I had held up between myself and every person, every room, everything that threatened to matter too much. I put it down. I stood in the light without it, next to a man who was learning to exist without his armor at approximately the same rate I was learning to exist without mine, and let the room be what it was: empty, quiet, full of what was coming, and found that the world, seen without glass between us, was not the dangerous thing I had always expected. It was just the world. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, that was enough.